Hello,
Hello.
can you hear me?
Perfectly.
I've got to wait a minute because I sent an email, of course. Right, so now I can share. There. Does that look
Great.
all right?
Yes, it does. It is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Professor John Baines. John is the titan of Egyptology, really, and he is now Professor Emeritus from the University of Oxford, where he was professor for more than 40 years. I think he was elected as professor when he was 30. Is that right, John?
Yes, that's right.
So that is incredibly, that is an incredible honor. He is also fellow of the British Academy, as well as fellow of the Queen's College at Oxford. So being the titan of Egyptology, John is an expert of any aspect of ancient Egyptian culture. You name it: art, literature, religion, identity, self-representation, the ideology of the Egyptian elites. But one of his main interests is writing and literacy and their interface with Egyptian culture. So this is why when I asked him to give a seminar for SCRIBO, which is a series of seminars devoted to ancient writing systems, he accepted, and I was very happy, and I was expecting him to be talking about early Egyptian and its script and the beginning of writing in Egypt. But to my surprise and delight, he decided to venture into the Chinese area. And with the help of a colleague, Chao Daji of the University of Peking, he decided to talk about both the Egyptian area and its early formation in terms of script, and China. And today, with the help of Chao Daji, who is not going to be joining us, but I think John's seminar relies heavily on his work, John will be presenting with the title Pairs of Early Script Forms, Contrasting Aesthetics in Early Egypt and China. And this is why Chao Daji's name features in the poster that you may have seen advertised all over social media. Before we begin with John's seminar, I would like to remind you that next week we're going to be having another seminar. Usually we do SCRIBO every 2 weeks, but next week we'll be presenting Willemien Dahl, who's the newly appointed director of NINO, the Netherlands Institute for the Near East, who will be talking about the origins of the Greek alphabet. And to give you a tantalizing hint, her title is Older Than It Appears, The Origins of the Greek Alphabet. So we'll see you next week, next Wednesday, the 15th of July at 4:30, and we're going to be advertising this seminar tomorrow, as of tomorrow. John is going to be answering all of your questions, and if you happen to have any questions at the end of his seminar in Italian, he's going to be happy to reply in Italian. So stay till the end, and John, over to you. Thank you so much for being here. It is such a delight.
Well, Sylvia, thank you very much indeed. And I want to make a few minutes of introduction. I will give you a picture, provided I can get it to work. So there is my first picture, and then I will give a few points of explanation before going into the lecture itself. The first thing to say is simply that this is a comparative lecture, and I think that by using comparison, one gets at ideas that one would not get at if one were only to use a single tradition. I think this is very important. And I'd like to mention three aspects of the tradition. There is the presence of images in both traditions. The nature of the images is extremely different between the two. There is the fact that writing can have an ornamental form, and the ornamental form can be extremely aesthetic, and that applies to both our cases, but in very different ways. And then there can be, as we might say, more ordinary writing. More ordinary writing is less aesthetic than these very highly decorative forms, but although it's less aesthetic, we must not exclude the aesthetic element anywhere, because the aesthetic is part of making things legible. A more aesthetic form of writing is also easier to read, so we are very much focused on aesthetic matters with writing as a whole, whatever the purpose for which it's used may be. Only if we are writing personal notes to ourselves are we likely to do something that has very little aesthetic component. The fourth thing I would say before going further is that I've got these two traditions I'm talking about today, and Egyptian is a hieroglyphic tradition. There is one other very major hieroglyphic tradition, which is the Maya tradition. I'm not going to say anything about it, simply to say that it is another way of using writing which is very distinctive. And I would argue that the phenomena I'm talking about in China have a parallel for that, but it's a relatively short-lived parallel. Now, in talking about the origins of writing, it's important to think about the aesthetic environment from which writing emerged, and that's what I'm going to try to do. So I'm starting both the halves of the lecture with examples from before writing is known, but not many centuries before, but what the environment was before writing appeared. And then I shall go a long way down in time and consider complex uses later on, where I see a parallel between Egypt and China. And in that case, the aesthetic component remains important. We are necessarily very dependent on what survives of writing, and that it is very different between Egypt and China because of different physical conditions and media on which writing was done. And the early Chinese evidence is very abundant in some areas, but also completely lacking in others. Now, I'm going to present this very simply. You have first a section on Egypt, then you have a section on China. I'm not going to interweave them. I think that could be confusing. So let's now go straight to the actual first picture. You see this ceremonial flint knife with an ivory handle, elaborately carved. You probably can't see anything on it, but we have a drawing. So in this drawing, you can see that you have rows of animals and on both sides. And then if we highlight a few features, you've got these other elements which are present in the composition, which are kind of like writing. Particularly look on the left, and you can see that there is a fish, and then there is a star. Now, neither a fish nor a star belongs in an environment where you have rows of animals. And this star element does seem to have been used as a hieroglyph briefly. It didn't continue to be used. The fish might also be an element of writing. So you have a state of affairs here where you have the very beginnings of a written tradition. I've dated this to around 3300, and that is about the same date as writing was invented in Egypt. But this is not an inscribed object, it's an object that is using one or two signs, which might or might not be writing for the person who created it, but it's using the same symbolism as lies behind some hieroglyphs. And now I just have a map to show you the places where these things come from. A lot of what's highlighted on the map will not be talked about for lack of time. The most important area is the Memphis area here on the map, and then the Abydos area where the first writing comes from, and Hierakonpolis near the bottom where writing didn't come, but we've got important finds of other sorts. And the site of Kostal in Nubia, I think I've excluded, but there it is. And here you have a chronology. So we're talking about the period roughly 3250 to something like 2200 is the range. So that is, in other words, about 1,000 years. But I'll skip very quickly. And since I mentioned the Maya, I thought I would add this reference you see at the bottom of the screen here, which is an article which I received just a few days ago, which compares the meaning and use of hieroglyphs between Egyptian and Maya scripts. So I thought it might be interesting for you to have that reference. Right, well, now we will go back to Hierakonpolis, where we can see a little bit more of the material culture context. This cemetery, which is called HK6, as it says at the bottom, is the elite cemetery of the Naqada II period. And it seems to have expanded from bottom left on this plan towards the upper right. 16, the complex 16 with T16 in the center, is older. And then T72, upper right, is a very high elite burial, perhaps of a ruler of a generation or two later. And we do have, the tomb was robbed, as almost all Egyptian tombs are, but there is still a very impressive inventory from this tomb, and here it is. And it does not include a single hieroglyph, but it does include lots of very miniature objects. And I think it's very important that in the century or two before writing was invented, there was a miniaturization of pictorial forms, and that leads directly into creating the super mini pictures, which were the point. You can see those two combs there, which have a hippo and possibly an antelope on them as elements. That would be the most distinctive feature, which you can parallel with hieroglyphs, but not very closely. But if you look at the scale on that, this is all very small. And at the same time, this is a very similar date here as a very famous tomb, tomb 100, not in the same area of the cemetery. You have a wall painting. And this wall painting is pretty crude, but you can see elements in it that relate to writing. If you look at the bottom left corner, you have a man smashing the heads of 3 people who are on a line. And those two elements, the 3, meaning the plural, and the line, are things that come into writing later. But it's not a beautiful picture, as I say, but it probably shows that there was a quite widespread use of paint on perishable surfaces in contexts that we don't have. And it's been suggested that this painting was very rapidly created as part of a funeral or something like that. Here are a couple of pots which also give you the pictorial background to the context in which writing would emerge perhaps a century later. Though, again, this is not very high art, as you might say, but it's important to think that you have a major pictorial context and that it is used on ceramics, on walls, and in 3 dimensions on small objects. And here, really, the most telling example is seals. So at the top of this image here, you have a number of seals, and the most distinctive ones are the top register I can't easily see because a bit of zoom is there. But if you look at the middle group, the right-hand image has registers of animals in opposite directions, which tends to highlight the middle group. This is all microscopic in scale. Then the lowest one is still more distinctive, the 3rd register down, where you've got 3 designs where you've got a largely different element against a repeated pattern. That different element is not writing, I don't think, but it is some sort of an emblem which is given prominence by the context in which it comes. And then, equally important but very different, at the bottom you have these two large pots which have very simple marks on them, but those marks belong to a vocabulary of marks, and there were pot marks was a major genre of communication in late prehistoric Egypt at about the same time as the writing system was developing. So now I will move to the next historical period. So that was Nakada 2. We're now at Nakada 3. And this symmetry at Abydos, symmetry U and symmetry B, from U at the top, B at the bottom. This is the symmetry which runs from Nakada 1 to Nakada 3. Nakada 3 is bottom left. And in this symmetry, there is one very distinctive tomb, tomb UJ, which is the most important early find that we have. So there is a photograph of tomb UJ as excavated. It was excavated in, or at least we learned about it in 1989. I think it was excavated over a year or two before that. And in this were a couple of hundred inscribed objects and more of another type, which we'll see in just a second. So here is, let's just say, by the way, that that is much the largest tomb in this cemetery. And as you can see, it's built of brick. So here are the first group of material. You've got these little tags, which are about 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters high. And they have typically 2 signs, sometimes 1, sometimes 3 or 4. And there are also, on the right, there are numbers. And the numbers are quite complicated, because if you look at the bottom left number, that gives you 10, which suggests that if you have 10 as units, you're not dealing with a normal decimal system. And the next one on the right there is the later sign for 100, not for 10. So these tags were probably attached to grave goods. They're made of bone or ivory. They're very expensive objects, and they were mass produced probably for the funeral. And this is the other type of find that we have. And you've got here 3 pots which have single signs on them. Well, the middle one might have 2, and quite a few of these pots do have 2. Let me correct myself. The left one shows a scorpion and a tree. The middle one shows a scorpion and something else. And the right one is not very clear. There were nearly 200 of the tags and around 100 of the pots. But the pots and tags don't certainly have the same signs on them. Nonetheless, you have 2 parallel systems, a very refined one for the tags and a relatively crude one for the pots. And if you think those pots are large, the one on the left is probably about 50 centimeters high, you're dealing with a display form of signing, to be vaguer, on this pot. So even this cruder form is actually part of a mortuary display. Now I've got a slide here of other material that comes from Tomb UJ. It had been very thoroughly robbed, but it had absolutely exquisite objects in it. So you've got a ruler's scepter, maybe, top left. You've got ivory gaming pieces, top middle, an ivory relief vase on the right, gaming sticks. The gaming sticks are used to as an object in a game to get a score, with fantastically fine decoration on them. And then, and this is something we can parallel from elsewhere, some gold foil, which had covered an object, we don't know what, but the gold foil was nailed there with gold nails. Now, making nails out of gold makes no practical sense. This is highly luxurious and symbolic activity. And then on the right, you have a bowl in the shape of a hand made of obsidian. So this was a person of enormous wealth who could use all sorts of artistic forms, including very probably ones in textiles, for the burial, and the writing is part of that aesthetic environment. Also from there we have these ceilings, and here are the designs, and the designs follow the same general organization as the ones I showed you earlier. A motif in the middle, in this case against what is presumably something like an imitation basketry or fabric background. But the bottom one is particularly close in style to later writing. But this sign system, shall we say, to be neutral, can't be deciphered. Various attempts have been made, but they're not very convincing. I think it's perhaps not useful to wonder about how to decipher it. And here, perhaps contemporary, you have the extraordinary development of pictorial forms at the same date. This is a piece from the art market, so it can't be dated very precisely. But the important thing is that you have an elaborate pictorial composition which occupies all of the surface except for the top right-hand corner, which is enlarged on the right. And the top right-hand corner shows a double-headed bull, or a double bull, and a building. But they're not to scale with the picture. They are presumably signs rather than images in a broader sense. And my guess is that this is a royal object, and that is perhaps the name of a king or something like that. And I would suggest that it belongs to the same general period. We couldn't date it to within a generation or two of the tomb, but not much later. Now that time is difficult to estimate, but it's a century or two before the beginning of the first dynasty in Egypt. And we can go, I just highlighted those two signs. We move very fast, we skip that period that I've just mentioned, and we're now near the end of that century or two, and we have pottery, which has signs on it. This pottery all comes from Symmetry B. In other words, it's back on that plan you saw a few minutes ago. So you've got two different painted elements. The left-hand group of 4 sherds has black lines on it. That's not writing, that's a painted pattern, or probably the paint imitates the idea of holding the vessel in a basketry, in some sort of a bag, of a rope bag. Then you've got small signs which are royal emblems, but they don't have legible signs within them. The bottom left one, and which is the same as the one on the right there, it looks very different, but I don't think anyone has offered a reading for it. But on the right, you have ones where readings have been offered. You've got 2, one above the other, which this is clearly a king's name. Unfortunately, the standard reading of Iri Hor, which is in quotes there, is probably not right. And Petrie, who excavated this about 1900, suggested Ro, which I think is perhaps better. And then you have another king whose name is of doubtful reading, but you've also got a photograph of an example of his pottery with these elements. And once you have that photograph, you can see that you've got half a dozen signs there. The writing system has developed enormously since Tomb UJ, and we now have the possibility of writing at least meaningful groups of signs. Probably that little group there means something like a delivery from the Delta, but we are certainly not going to dive that opinion. Top right, you have the name of king, normally called Nama, but Joachim Pfack has shown that he should probably be called Nameher, and again this delivery sign next to it. So this is cursive writing done on a large scale on pottery, all from royal burials. And at the same time, we are with Nameher here again. You have the completely developed system here, which is also a complete integration of writing and image. So if you look on the left, you've got the image of the king about to smite his enemy. Behind him, his sandal bearer has a couple of signs written next to him, and those are signs that identify him, I think probably not by name, but by function. Narmeher's name is written in the top between the two cow heads. And if you go to the other side, you've got the same sorts of elements present. And so there are all sorts of ways in which we can distinguish hieroglyphs by scale and by the way they're laid out and so on from images. But there is a complete integration in the Egyptian system of the two ways of doing things. And obviously, it's a huge advantage that the writing retains its pictorial character because they don't shout at each other. They blend together well. And that was always true of ancient Egypt. If you think of the development of, let's say, Greek ceramics in the first millennium, then the earlier examples quite often have writing on them, but it doesn't do anything good to the picture. And in the end, the picture wins. In Egypt also, we should say that the picture wins in that pictures have a higher value than writing, but writing and pictures work together well. And sorry, one more thing I meant to say there is if you look at the group on the left in front of the king, that is what's called an emblematic group, which lies halfway between writing and picture. And that style of communication came in as part of this overall system. So you don't just have writing and pictorial representation, you have writing, pictorial representation, and the mixed mode between them. And you also can take hieroglyphs and detach them and use them as emblems in the way that is done on these objects here. These are grinding palettes for eye paint, probably. And the pair of arms around all of them is a sign of something like passing power down the generations. One of the color example in the middle doesn't have anything. And the one on the right is particularly interesting because it has a set of 3 true hieroglyphs at the top. Those are hieroglyphs for life, duration, power, and they are ones that belong to the king. But this is not from a royal tomb. Like the knife we began with, it's probably something donated by the king to a favored subordinate. But that practice then disappears. That's a very short-lived thing. But we're trying to move fast. Here we have a very schematic map. It's actually not, it's 2 plans of the area around Memphis. Memphis is the dark gray line in the middle. And on the left, you have this group of super elite tombs on the edge of the escarpment facing into the Nile Valley. And that's where the next object will come from. But on the right, the other side of the Nile Valley, you have a still elite but less elite cemetery at the site of Helwan. So Saqqara left, Helwan right. This is the tomb that I wanted to mention, tomb 3505. And this is a truly enormous structure, as you can see from the scale at the bottom. It's about 50 or 60 meters wide and maybe 30 meters deep. You can see in the middle left at the bottom of the solid structure is where we will now have a photographic view. There we are. And in the foreground there, have I highlighted it? Yes. You have a large piece of stone which was found there. It's a bit problematic exactly what this all looked like, but we won't discuss that now. But we can show you the object itself. It's not an object of great beauty, as you can see, but it is the largest early inscription we have from Egypt. And this man is a man of the very highest status, just below the king. And they used ways of designing which then became unfashionable later. Basically, you would normally use hieroglyphs at only 1 scale in most cases, always exceptions, of course. So you read this in vertical columns from right to left. And the left column, the last column, the signs are much larger. And that's because they include his most important official titles. The top title is of uncertain reading. The next one means a member of the elite group, possibly a kinship term, and then that's 3 signs. And then the next 2 signs, including the bird, read sem and refer to a priestly function, probably in charge of the king's clothing, followed by his name. So by this date, which is effectively under 200 years since writing began to be widely used, you have a proliferation of official functions and enormous prestige associated with them and hierarchies to match with them. And writing is being used, we're now actually going back in time for all sorts of other purposes. These are the remote successors of the tags you saw from 2μj. These are much larger than the earlier ones. These are, well, wait, the top right-hand one is about 10 centimeters wide. And they have essentially pictorial content with some signs. So pictures are still winning. But if you look at the bottom right-hand set of tags, that's no longer true. That's from the last king of the first dynasty. And here you have the writing is in vertical columns, and it is essentially, let's say, textual. It is not continuous language or syntax. It's important to say this. These are more like annotations at this date, but that doesn't make them any less important. And we then get, we've now gone down more than a century more, and we have here the earliest example of continuous sentences that we can show you, which is not necessarily the earliest that existed, of course. So top right, let's see what it gives you next. Yes, right at the bottom there, you have a translation of what's up at the top. And so that is a ceiling reconstructed from several examples. And it actually says the god Seth has joined the 2 lands for his son. And if you read from left to right, this is reversed from what it would be on the seal. You have the group of 4 signs top to bottom, and that with a little bit left out means he has joined. So it's a proper verbal form. So writing has expanded enormously in potential, and very probably it was being used in other media, notably papyrus, which had been invented already 150 years earlier or more for administrative and high cultural purposes. But you've also got on this slide images of the base of that statue on the left. And you can see here that writing is being blended with pictures in a nearly unique way. You've got numerals for captives, imaginary numbers, 47,209 poor dead people. And then these dead people go around the side, but they are the same size as the hieroglyphs. And that's a way of mixing writing and images which we don't get in later periods. But the tradition of the tags and the seals continues in various ways. And so on the left, you have the annals developed at a much later date, but from authentic sources. And you see very similar writing to what you saw on those tags, but in detail, it's all different. We can't actually align one with the other, although we think that some of the content is similar. Then on the right, you have 2 seals which were developed during the first dynasty to give you something like a king list. So extremely important things are being recorded in writing, and they are part of a transmission to later periods. That's the back of the stone you saw the front of a moment ago. This is in Palermo for those of you who are in or about to visit Sicily. Here you have an example of how the list making and tabular form of writing wins in many ways. Here it says I have a translation. It's hidden by somebody's zoom on my screen. I hope you can see it. It says the dual king Usakaf he made as his monument for, and then you've got a set of boxes running vertically giving the continuing content. And here is papyrus being used for administration at a slightly earlier date, at the same date as the Great Pyramid. And this papyrus was found about 10 years ago. So here is a seemingly everyday form of writing, but it's very difficult to see what the function of this writing was. Why would you note down after you've delivered something that you put the stone into a ship and took it across the river? It's puzzling. But it does show you that as in all administration, once administration begins, it goes further than it needs to. Here are later administrative papyri to do with a royal mortuary temple. In this case, not in a cursive, that's a cursive script there. This is formal hieroglyphs here. But on a larger scale, the administrative content is in cursive script in hieratic. So you here have the cursive script clearly distinguished, although present on the same document as the hieroglyphs. That's a modern transcription of what's on the right there. And just, I'm actually moving towards the end of the Egyptian section now. You have here the longest known inscription for a king in this period. I omitted the date, which is about 2450. And there at the top, well, sorry, in red there, you've got a title, a sort of caption to the scene, and then the about 10 columns of vertical hieroglyphs at the top give a narrative of the king doing something utterly ridiculous and absurd, which we can't believe really happened. I could go on, but I won't. But I move here to another way in which pictures mean more than texts. This is actually a much older and much longer inscription on a non-royal tomb. It's the longest early inscription we have from Egypt by a long way. And it deals with the property arrangements for this member of the high elite who is below royal status. The object is in the Berlin Museum. And the translation there is of the part of it that the owner thought most important, which is written in continuous language, whereas the rest of it is annotations. But those little figures on the left, which are offering bearers, actually have a higher status in many ways than the writing. And there, just to raise a problem, is a rock inscription of the late Old Kingdom. And we'll have another one in a moment. That comes from near Aswan. And you should bear in mind that hieroglyphs were hardly used in public places until a much later date. So this is one of the earliest, which would have been outside where people could go and see it, provided the area was not off limits or something. And that is a pair of rather scrappy hieroglyphic inscriptions, which are out in the desert near a desert shrine, put up as graffiti. And that is something else that develops. And now we're getting to where I will give you a parallel with China. You've got here a picture of a high official with a column of titles in front of him. And there is the translation of them. And as you can see, they're very formal. The king's acquaintance, priest of a solar temple, overseer of the manicurists of the palace. This is very unusual. One rewarded by the king, keeper of secrets. These are not the highest titles, but he's still a very prominent individual. Now, how do you, that's his son who's standing there. How do you control this enormous elite that has developed over all this time? We'll come to that actually in a second. Here is just another example where we have the titles written in 4 columns above the figure there, and then a large group of registers of scenes in a country estate. And there is a photograph, and it gives here non-verbally with using infinitive what he's doing, and then a set of titles for this man who is the highest official of state. We move on now. Let's not. So that was the latest example I gave you. I cut out, which I then need to mention verbally, that these titles were then organized into hierarchies, and kings would manipulate their elite by shifting around the hierarchy all the time. So I've put early Bronze Age East Asia rather than China, because China is, of course, a much later idea. These people in the early Bronze Age didn't know that they were in China, and we should perhaps not be telling them that either. So there you have Anyang, to be precise, Yinshu, and that is a reconstructed palace at Anyang on the site, the most important site of the Shang, the late Shang period. We'll go back from that in a minute. And here is the chronology. Now, that was colored at a point when I hadn't developed this lecture. And so the early Tao period is before writing. Early Gang is the first really large-scale development of civilization in China. And that, we are suggesting, did have a writing system, although it can't be proved. And then Shao Shang Chao to Huanbei is the late early Gang, or possibly a separate phase, where we do have some evidence of writing. Yinshu, which you just saw a second ago, is the enormous development of late Shang. So here's a map to situate all this. Luoyang on the left is the central area where the early Tao phase developed, or rather is best known. Zhengzhou is the type site, well, not the type site. Early Gang is a suburb of Zhengzhou, where the early Gang phase was first identified. And there is Anyang highlighted, and Panlongchong at the bottom, in the suburb of Wuhan, which everyone knows about now, is the greatest extent to which early Gang finds penetrate. And so here Cao Daju's name is on, because this actually is material that derives from him, but I will go back in time when I get to his specific contribution. There is the reference to his very important publication, which he has talked through with me, because I'm afraid I can't read Chinese. So we're now going back to the early Gang period to give you a sense of the aesthetic context in which the writing appears. These bronzes are the great product of early Gang China. And the most distinctive feature is the decorative bands, which you can see on all of them, and you can see that they have a repertory that is very similar between them. Bronzes are undoubtedly, by a long way, the most important finds, but we'll come to another question which we can answer better for a later period. But let's then show you other early Gang bronzes which come from Panlongchong. And you can see that in these examples, the decorated area has grown a lot. And this decoration is non-pictorial in a narrow sense. You've got those studs, which are eyes, and a mask-like form around the eyes, and that is called a taotie. I'm afraid I spelled that out. And that is the essential decorative element. You have dragon motifs and things like this, but it's all extremely linear and decorative. It's not pictorial in the Egyptian way. Here you have, going back to early Gang, you have these totally colossal bronzes that were found in the 1980s. So the photograph on the left gives you some sort of a human scale for them. Those bronzes weigh hundreds of kilos. And there is an example of essentially the same decorative techniques as you saw a minute ago. So this is a fantastic cultural investment. But from Shao Shuang Chao, you have here some sherds which have signs on them. which are thought to indicate writing. And this is late early Gang in terms of period. Here is the material of a different sort. So you've got some amulets, which clearly do have writing on them. The left-hand one is particularly clear. And then bottom, hardly visible, that table there, shows you a comparison of writing from Shaoshang Chao and writing from Anyang. And they are very similar to each other. So it seems pretty clear that there is a direct development from the early Gang phase, which is not attested more than these tiny fragments, to Anyang. Why is this? Well, probably it's because they were writing on materials that do not survive. But the early Gang phase is already a completely enormous state. It is on a high-speed train, it takes at least 2 hours to get from Zhengzhou to Wuhan. In other words, it's about 600 km. And now we move to Yinshu Anyang, and you see how enormous the development was at this phase, which is therefore late Shang. That is tomb M1001, which is very famous. It's thought to be the tomb of King Wuding, who is the earliest king attested at Anyang. He would follow immediately after the late early Gang or Huanbei Shaoshang Chao phase. And here is the decorative environment. Now, unfortunately, no palace survives, so that is a complete fake, top left. But the assumption is that the decorative materials that were used on the bronzes were everywhere. And that's why in reconstructing that, they put the same basic designs on those columns. Then on the right, you have a chime stone, a musical instrument, which has a dragon in a rather simple design, but it's the same type, as you can see. And then bottom right, actually, it's a fantastically complex object and it's very large. It's nearly 1 meter, one end to the other, made of marble. Bottom left, this is in a way the most valuable of the lot, lacquer, which hardly survives, with a dragon design on it from tomb M1001 that you saw a second ago. And here, more of the context, the same basic design vocabulary on jades, jade being the premier product of decoration at a small scale, but used for jewels and amulets and so on. And then top right, this is a cheat, a statue of a different culture, but the same basic design types, as you can see, from Sanshengdui, which is in Sichuan, about 1200 km southwest. And we move to bronzes now, a bronze axe. There you have something that could be a human face, but anyway, it's a clear face. And then you have the development of a pure pattern, bottom left, on a very large bronze, and then these amazing developments which are animal, not human focused, on many different types of bronze vessel. None of that has writing on it, but we will come to exceptions in a moment. This is just to give you the ultimate development of these decorative styles. So this is towards the end of Anyang. And on the left, you have this fantastically elaborate vessel. On the right, one that's rather plainer, but look at the size of these things. They are absolutely colossal. And the largest bronze vessel found in the Anyang area is in weight the same as all the bronze that has been found from Bronze Age Britain. So this is an investment on a scale that's almost unimaginable. But what about writing? So here you have on the left a cheat that is from about 200 BCE, a roll of bamboo, which of inscribed bamboo. That's the normal ancient Chinese form of writing. And the sign in the middle shows you exactly that, a set of bamboo strips bound together with string. That's the normal form of writing. And then how do you brush? But there is a fantastic change between the Huanbei stage and Anyang. So on the left, you have oracle bone, an oracle bone from the Huanbei stage, and it has the distinctive markings, which are to do with how you use bones for oracles, but no writing. On the right, you have a turtle shell, a plastron to be precise, which has writing on it. On top left, and that comes from Shaotun, which is part of the Anyang site. The Anyang site is enormous. It's more than 30 square km. Here is another pair of, in this case, 2 turtle plastrons, and you can see that the writing on these is cut into this very hard surface, and it survived because these objects were then deposited in pits after they'd been finished with. The right-hand one is the back of a plastron, and in this case, it has ink writing against some of the indentations. The indentations are how you conduct the oracle. And if you look at a sign here, I can't get my cursor to go to it, but near the bottom, just to the left of middle, you have a sign which is very similar to the one that you saw for the sign for a scribe or an official. That is an example of the type of material. So this is all about consulting oracles. Now, the script is fully capable of writing anything it wants in language. It took the Egyptian about 400 years to get to that stage from the first development of the sign system. If we suppose that writing, or something we might call writing, was developing from sometime in early Gang to Wuding, that's not more than about 200, 250 years. This is a very rapid development. But it's impossible for most of us to imagine that you would invent a writing system which could write absolutely anything in a generation, which was the old view of how Chinese writing emerged. Here is just a set of ground plans of elite residences at Anyang, and that's there to give you a context for what comes next. What comes next, therefore, are these amazing bronzes of extraordinary elaboration, and these have patterns on the outside, as you can see, and what's on the right is on the inside. It's a pair of elements. These used to be called clan signs, but Saudadra calls them official titles. And so he has 2, this is contentious, let me tell you. It's contentious for 2 reasons. One is not everyone believes what Saudadra argues, and the other is that whether that this, if it's a title prince, like using the word prince in pre-revolutionary Russia, it doesn't mean that you were a king's son, it means you have a high title. So this is title plus name. Here is another example of this, and this is much more complex because the square element within which a couple of signs are written is thought to be a word for deputy, and then you've got a name and another title, and that is on the inside of the bronze on the right. Now my view, and Saudadra agrees with me about this, is that a reason for explaining why these signs are not written on the outside is that there is an incompatibility between the style of decoration that's being used and writing. So it's the opposite of the Egyptian case. And so you put it on the inside because it's not quite nice to put it on the outside, because this is fantastically important, this decoration. Or you can put it, in this case of a rather modest vessel, it's beneath the handle where you can hardly see it. And there's one other exception, which is here. If you have these bowls, if you look at the bowl in profile, I don't have an image, then you can't see into the bowl. But the bowl has a design, see right at the top, and that also has writing on it. But first, look at this other bowl, bottom left, where you've got this fantastically beautiful pattern, which has some writing in it, highlighted with by that red ring, but you can't decipher it. Well, nobody has deciphered it yet. And if you go to the right, you've got signs clearly visible here, but they're not visible from a distance. They're only visible if you're actually using the vessel from the inside. And then the last example is the most telling in a way. That is Lady Fu Hao, who is one of the consorts of Wu Ding, and she has a very elaborate writing of her name on this bit of blank space, very unusual to have blank space, on the interior of this bowl. Later on, writing proliferates considerably. Here is this rhino, and the rhino, it has no writing on the outside, but it has writing on the inside. And writing is developed for use for an inscription. So if we call the oracle bones records, let's say, they're not things for permanency or for anyone to look at later. This inscription here is for your ancestors to read, and it is quite beautifully arranged, but it's in ordinary script. And you can see in the photograph how it is right inside the vessel. Well, that is giving you the background, as I see it, to why these things are not very prominent. But there are examples of, there are always exceptions, there are examples of the clan signs, so-called, on the outside. Now here is the repertory that Zhao Dazhe has developed of signs that occur, and this is wonderfully organized in China. You have databases, you can look them up in, and so on. And these, for all of these, he believes he can give readings as titles. Not only that, but you can then compare occurrences on the Anyang vessels, here they are, with ones from the succeeding Western Zhou period. And you've got visibly the same signs, but in the Western Zhou period, the signs have become less pictorial and they have more writing around them. And so there's a clear tendency there. That I can't read to you. And here are cases where you have a sense of a hierarchy of officials. So you have words for chief and words. The chief is this man sign, middle of the top. Deputy is the square that we looked at before. And there are various very, very highly ornamental combinations. And then, very important, at the bottom, you have examples of material that is earlier than Anyang, which already has these similar elements on it. So Zhao Dazhe's interpretation is that you have a developed official and perhaps more elite and ceremonial hierarchy around the ruler, which is manifest in these signs and which is related to, well, it uses signs of writing, but the writing then disappears, as we see from this example here. So this is right at the end of the Anyang period, top left, under one of the last Anyang kings, and any pictorial element you might have seen is pretty much vanishing, but it's quite a significant inscription. So people are moving over to having language rather than the beautiful form of the semi-pictorial signs as the main feature. And then the lower one, it excites people tremendously because it gives you the date of the fall of Anyang, or just a few days later. Let's not assume that these were very charming cultures. And so I have this picture of a human sacrifice pit from Anyang to remind you of that. And on the right, you have a deposit of oracle bones. Hundreds of thousands of oracle bones have been found, of which only a minute fraction are inscribed, but still it's many thousands. And the same sort of thing in Egypt, where you have a tomb from the end of the period we've talked about. But if you look on the right there, you see an erased area. And that erased area was a figure of the tomb owner. And then in the middle, you have an inscription, very short one, and it turns out that the original owner of the tomb was banished and probably killed, and his tomb was then assigned to some other member of the elite. Would you like to be buried in the tomb of somebody who had just been executed? It's not very friendly, really, is it? But I will leave you with that thought, and I hope I've given enough to talk about the writing systems and how they relate to pictorial factors between these two examples. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, John. What a rich and detailed array of parallels. Can I just, before I leave the questions to the audience, can I point out that you've had so many participants listening to you? We actually reached the limit of the Zoom capacity. So I am hoping that loads more other people managed to join on the live stream on Facebook, but this was clearly a great success. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.
Could I please ask the first question, and then I'll leave the stage to other people that may have even more intelligent questions that I may ask. But I was very surprised to notice that your presentation, in a way, and Chowdhury's work subverts the common view of a sort of a fast and very swift formation for the script in China. Probably we need to push our early instances of script formation in China to a much earlier stage. And I remember reading an article by Desmater a couple of years ago, and I think it came out 10 years ago, claiming that instances of writing in China may date back to the Neolithic stage. And this is the first question. How do you see this pushing back of the earliest instances of writing in China to such a degree? And secondly, I would like to ask you whether, given the evidence that we have for a gradual development of the script in China, whether we could be so simplistic as to actually finally claim that all writing systems which are invented from zero as original creations take a gradual step, take a sort of a long time to develop, because the common view is quite not adamant that this is the case. So would we want to venture into being more daring and saying, yes, actually, script invention is a very long and gradual process? And equally, when it comes to the Egyptian stage, which took a very long time, you mentioned 400 years, we could see something odd there happening at some point, because it, from your presentation and from what you've written in the past, it seems to explode. There is a point in time in which writing takes a long time to develop, but then it receives a really strong kick, and then it explodes and it expands, and it gathers momentum, and it becomes as expansive and omnipresent as we know the Egyptian use of writing to be. So could I just frame these three questions into one, and asking you, well, how do we see the development of these two writing systems in parallel, in terms of, on the one hand, the time that it takes and the momentum that it needs to gather in order to take pace and expand?
Well, let's hope I can give you something. In the Chinese case, the argument is quite hypothetical. Now, I don't believe that this talk about Neolithic writing in Egypt. I think that you have sign systems, perhaps, that develop on pottery, and possibly, I think, on jades in Liangzhu, but they don't seem to endure, and they don't seem to have direct successors. As I mentioned, in Egypt, you had pot marks running in parallel with writing, but they're not the same thing. So the argument is roughly that you have a little bit of definite evidence from Shuaishang Zhao, which you can date a couple of hundred years, up to a couple of hundred years before Anyang, in a context where you've already got a large-scale civilization. Unfortunately, what you call civilization and how large-scale it is and so on is difficult to assess. But for the preceding early Tao phase, there is no direct evidence, and even these decorative systems don't seem to have taken off to the extent they did, or if they existed in media that don't survive. Now, the development from early Kang to Anyang would be about 200, 250 years, something like that. And that is, I would say, a pretty rapid, much more rapid than the Egyptian case. But the system didn't change so radically over time as the Egyptian did, in the sense that the Egyptian, when it started, doesn't have any clear relationship with language, and then it acquires that. In the Chinese case, well, we can't tell because there's too little early evidence, but by the time of Anyang, you clearly have a writing system that has all the features that later writing systems, the later Chinese writing system has. So I'd say that China is actually quite rapid, just much less rapid than people used to think. But the very early evidence, I think, should probably be ignored. Now, in the Egyptian case, I suppose I'd say that the system develops with consciously. In other words, somebody or a group of people, not one individual, I expect, decides to have a system, and that is present in 2μj. And of course, we must never assume that the earliest example we have is the earliest that existed. So it could have happened some generations earlier. And then we have a gap in attestation, but then there seems to be a very strong development around the beginning of the dynastic period, maybe what we call Dynasty 0, and then that is seemingly followed by a further major development in the second dynasty sometime, leading to the full notation of language with particles and verbal forms and all those features. Now, that is a complexity that you don't have in the Chinese case, because Chinese is a very different sort of language, which operates with single morphemes. And so maybe the Chinese had less trouble with developing writing than the Egyptians. But I must say, I think that's an unlikely argument. I think the people were intelligent and they could do it if they wanted to, but they didn't have a plan to do it, would be more my point. How pervasive writing was in Egypt, it's very difficult to say. I showed you that papyrus with a seemingly pointless record of moving stone around for the Great Pyramid. And that definitely gets you to a phase where people are writing absolutely everything down that matters in a prestigious context. How far people used writing in the wider society is still not known, and probably never will be, because it was done on materials that don't survive and in muddy places where it doesn't survive. Is that enough of a sort of set of...
That is a wonderful answer. Thank you, Sean. I have many more, especially when it comes to the linguistic mechanisms that make writing a possibility, but I'll leave the audience to ask more questions. Is there anybody that wants to venture?
Can I ask?
Yes, please.
So yeah, I'm a student at UCLA, like my undergrad, and I've talked briefly with Professor Lothar von Falkenhausen. He's an art history professor, yeah, in ancient China, and so he was pretty convinced that perhaps like there was something like stimulus diffusion in ancient China, because I know it's much later than like the invention of writing than Egypt. That perhaps the idea of writing came into China, and that's what caused the sort of idea to arise quicker. So I guess I have a two-part question for you. First, like, do you think that within the case of Egypt, that it perhaps the sort of origin of writing was brought on from Mesopotamia? And then also, is it possible that within the context of China, we had something similar where the idea of writing actually was brought there?
That's a very difficult question to answer. In the case of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the earliest writing is almost exactly the same date in the two places. And because of that, to say which came first isn't possible. But there is a much clearer genealogy to writing in Mesopotamia than in Egypt. So you can trace formative stages of sign systems which lead to writing. But we have to remember that the the earliest, in quotes, full writing that we have, the Uruk 4 writing, can't actually be read. It is a sign system which people probably used writing to, used language with, but exactly how they did that, we don't know. So the relationship between writing and language can be a problem in itself. Now, the other question as to whether the Chinese got an idea of writing from a long way away, it is, in terms of chronology, it's possible. And people do think that bronze technology came to China from outside, and, for example, the chariot. Well, the chariot is extremely big as new technology at Anyang. But within the case of bronze came rather earlier to China than there's any direct attestation of writing. So it is possible that the idea came from somewhere else, but I think it's even possible to be sure. Since the Chinese writing system doesn't resemble the Egyptian in any meaningful way, or the Mesopotamian, perhaps it's a bit closer to Mesopotamian writing, but only very little closer, I think you'd have to assume that they started from scratch when they developed Chinese writing, whether they knew that writing happened somewhere else or not. I hope that's enough as an answer.
Yeah, no, that definitely clears things up. Thank you.
There is a raised hand from Tian Tian, please.
Oh,
hi, Professor Baines. Nice to see you online. Hi, I have one question. I'm thinking about the writing as a practice that may stimulate a more radical, swift change in the Chinese script, as in compare with early dynastic Egyptian material, which is brushes on portraits and papyrus, perhaps, which is relatively soft. The Chinese deal with bones, which is hard to carve. Could that actually, be a catalyst that push Chinese to have a more radical and faster change in their script than Egyptian one?
No, I actually don't think that's likely, because you've got these elements of writing, for example, on the back of that plastron I showed, where it's done in ink. And I think ink was the preferred medium. And the fact that the sign for scribe shows this bundle of bamboo strips suggests that would have been the normal way of writing. So I think the writing on bone and on turtle shell was obviously it was very important as an important institution, but I think it's secondary. I think the primary writing was on media that we don't have. So I don't think the actual hard material is what brought it. Chinese writing is about a curved stroke rather than a linear stroke. And obviously you get the linear stroke on the oracle bones because that's easier to cut, but it's not a primary thing. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And next we have Drew Longacre, who raised a hand. Drew?
Yes, Professor Baines, thank you so much. It was very interesting to see that. I've been thinking more about kind of a comparative approach myself. I'm curious about your experience with that project. You said that you don't speak Chinese, you don't read Chinese. It seems you've kind of ventured out beyond your comfort zone a little bit. As someone who's also trying to consider more broadly different fields and cultures that are a bit out of my comfort zone and expertise, I'm curious about two questions. What was that experience like for you trying to work in a comparative way with a new system that you're not really an expert in? And how do you navigate those questions methodologically about what is really relevant and what is not relevant? What is simply correlation versus causation?
Well, I suppose that the first answer to the first one is, although I've been going to China for about 5 years now, so I've become fairly familiar with the look of Chinese material, and I've actually been reading about China for more than 20 years now. And then I worked with Cao Daja, who worked with me 5 years ago now for a lecture series. And then I've had a lot of discussions with him, but he is the driving force in the ideas for this interpretation of these so-called clan signs, or as he views it, official titles. But he actually came to this as an idea on a comparative basis that if titles are a fantastically important element, as they are in Egypt, and remained so for millennia, then perhaps viewing these things as titles rather than clan signs would give a more meaningful way to approach them. And so these two things come together. So I obviously I can't read this material linguistically, but I have acquired some visual visual familiarity with some of these signs, but I don't know Chinese. But I think collaboration is the way to go about questions like this. Nobody can do everything, and it's very good to work with other people, and other people can put you right when you're wrong, and so on.
I couldn't agree more, if I may chip in. Are there any more questions? Can I ask one? Well,
Yes.
well, maybe Barbara. Oh, Barbara, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, thanks. Hello. May I ask a question about the distinction between writing signs, pictorial representations, emblems, a mix of pictorial representation and writing signs? I'm using terms that you used in your presentation because I think it's a very interesting topic for who is studying Cretan hieroglyphic scripts too. You have shown how inscriptions were blended with images, especially in Egypt at the beginning of the dawn of the script of the writing practices. I'd like to ask you if you have any suggestion about the criteria, which criteria we should use, we should imply in order to distinguish between emblems, proper writing signs, pictorial representation, when we are dealing maybe with an undeciphered scripts like Cretan hieroglyphic. Because we have also this, we see this phenomenon also in the first attestations and the earliest attestation of Cretan hieroglyphic script, but it is difficult to distinguish between these categories. It's not always so clear. So I'd like to ask if you have any suggestion about the criteria which we can apply based on your experience about the Egyptian hieroglyphic script and China.
Well, yes, I think both the cases that I talked about give you a good sense of what the problems are. In the case of Egypt, you have three terms, as I think I said, that you have pictures, you have writing, and then you have this intermediate form that I call emblematic, and that is quite distinctive because either you have a single hieroglyph which is not in the context of a linguistic group or anything, or you have a hieroglyph, a hieroglyph and sometimes other things which are given human arms in order to be able to do something. And so that is like an emblem. So it's convenient to call that emblematic. It may not be the best term, but it works nonetheless. Normally you can tell hieroglyphs from other things by questions of scale. Simply a pictorial image is much bigger, but this is all a matter of the conventions of a particular system. If you think about the Chinese case, you've got these signs that Saldaja has been working on, and they have reasonably strong pictorial elements. People tend to assume that Chinese writing began with pictures and lost the pictorial form, and many people to this day learn that all Chinese signs are pictures, which is a little bit hard when many of them are actually combinations of unrelated things, even if 3,000 years ago they could have had a pictorial element. So in practice, from the Western Zhou period on, Chinese writing is not pictorial. Now, what you're having at Anyang, it seems, is you've got on these vessels, you have these pictorial-looking signs, which are in a context which is not pictorial in that sense. It is very highly patterned, and it's patterns derived from elements of imaginary beings, dragons and things like this. And that seems not to fit with a normal understanding of what a picture is, but it gives you a certain independence to that. Whereas these signs do relate to signs in the more normal everyday script. So I think we can sort of see how that kind of makes sense as a grouping in a different way from the Egyptian one. Now with Cretan hieroglyphic, because I don't know it, I can't really comment. We're very lucky in Egypt because we have lots of material, and familiarity with lots of material helps you tremendously. If you've got a very small corpus, it is extremely difficult. And I admire people who tackle these much more difficult cases.
Thank you very much.
The fact that Cretan hieroglyphic is undeciphered for the length of its life doesn't help either. There is a question in the chat from Chris Williams. Do you see any parallels with the Akan Adinkra symbols?
I think I have heard of them, but that is about all I can say about them, I'm afraid. So without some actual knowledge, I really can't answer that question. I'm sorry.
We're sorry, Chris.
Presumably things in Ghana in the last couple of centuries, I suppose. Is that right?
To be honest with you, I have no idea. I just confess my complete ignorance in the subject. I think Miguel wanted to. Yes, Chris maybe wants to give us some context for the Akan Adinkra symbols. Chris? He unmuted.
If not, I would have a question, if I may.
Yes, of course.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this very rich talk. For me, especially, it's been a real pleasure and delight to be able to learn so much about the Asian contexts, of which I admittedly know much less than Egypt and the neighboring regions. In terms of writing, I would have so many questions to ask, especially in comparative terms. For example, in Egypt, we have these titles, but also sareh and later cartouche. And in China, we seem to find also some similar solutions. But the question I really would like to ask, concerns the social context in which writing booms in different regions. There is this old debate concerning the relationship between the origins of the state and the origins of writing, which depends also much on how we define state, of course. Seeing all of this contextual archaeological evidence, for example, the use of titles and the emergence of the so-called elites, the aspect of violence, defeated enemies, even if only in depictions, as in one of the cases you showed from Egypt. Do you think there is something to be learned, something worth exploring regarding this relationship?
Well, I think there is, but I think it's very difficult to answer. You can't say, well, once a society acquires a particular scale, it needs writing, because you have the case of the Andes, where you have enormous societies developing that don't have writing. And there's also the assumption, which is based on Mesopotamia, primarily, that writing is developed for purposes of administration. This is likely to be true in Mesopotamia. It's less clear in Egypt. the assumption that most people who deal with ancient China have is that this was also true in China, that you have a far larger polity than anywhere in Western Asia or Europe had developed, and it needed writing, in quotes, but it's really guesswork, I think. Talking about the state, as you rightly say, how you define the state is very difficult. I think the best case to think with is probably the Central American case, the scripts in Mesoamerica, which developed from a very early date, maybe from about 1000 BCE, something like that. And as far as anyone can tell, they were not used for everyday administration in basically ever. Although by the time you get to the Aztecs, you're getting documents which are valuable for things like property ownership. But the problem is obviously that the environment is such that you're not going to get finds of material that's written on organic substances. So we can't exclude an administrative function for writing, but we can say that writing was extraordinarily highly developed in Mesoamerica for aesthetic purposes and for purposes of prestige, and in order to validate and give meaning to the roles of elites. And actually, I could add something to what I said to Barbara, which is that the Maya case is the best one for thinking about the relationship between script and language and writing and image. And if you read that article by Steve Houston and Andreas Stauder that I gave a reference to, you'll find that's particularly valuable, I think. But so both in Egypt and among the Maya, there's an extraordinary value given to the symbolic and aesthetic aspects of writing, which seem to have a greater importance than they do even in China, I think. In China, so these forms that I showed you disappear after the Anyang period. Writing, of course, continues and is used on an enormous scale. And then other arts which exploit writing develop to do with calligraphy and things like that. But they are very different. Writing never then looks like pictures, or only a tiny bit. In the Islamic world, you get an extraordinary development of writing for aesthetic purposes, which is done with an alphabet, of course. And so there are many ways to go about this, but I would tend not to put too much emphasis on the administrative side, because it is only one of the possibilities. It may be the most important one, but it's not everything. I hope that gives you something useful.
Yes, yes. Of course, I've read some of these contributions. For example, in the book, the first writing. So I'm familiar with some of the ideas that have been debated in the last couple of decades, I think. But my question was also in terms of, as some people have proposed, is there perhaps some room to move beyond this apparent dichotomy between administration and religion or ritual, and rethink the social uses of writing? For example, what lessons can we learn from the social context of early Chinese writing, and what can we learn by comparing them with Egypt, for example? Because I have the impression that we hear much about the oracle bone inscriptions, but there are also other kinds of objects, if I'm not mistaken. Some of the pieces we've seen, jade halberds with inscriptions, speaking of gifts and things like that. what can we say a bit more about those social uses of writing in early China?
I think what you say is quite correct. And so you have writing, there are one or two famous examples. For example, there's a tiger bone, which has an inscription on it, which is inlaid in some precious material. I forget what it is. And that records that this is the fierce tiger that the king killed on a particular hunt. Hunting is fantastically important. So writing could enter most high prestige aspects of elite life, let's say. But the problem is essentially the very limited evidence you have, because almost nothing on organic materials survives except for the oracle bones. You've got the ancestor cult. So the bronzes are part of a religious cult. You acquire the means from some deed of yours. The king then rewards you, and you can then afford to have a bronze made, which you will dedicate to your ancestors. And so religion there and court hierarchies and things like that all come together. And there is a remarkable inscription of the Western Zhou period where it says that the protagonist was rewarded in the king's presence, and he then was given bamboo strips, which he then tied to his belt as he walked away. So you have an administrative document being the grant of the favor from the king, which is at the same time a display object. Now, when I mentioned this to some sinologist colleague, she said, "Oh, but that's the only example you have of that." But even so, I think it's very, very revealing as to how writing can function in many different ways at the same time. And I would certainly assume that you shouldn't think of writing as penetrating all levels of society, that if you are the average peasant in the Western Zhou period, you probably never see writing, or if you do, it's only to oppress you, because as we know, writing can be used for that too.
Yes.
So I think it's very good to have a flexible view of what the possibilities are, basically.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Lingfei Lin, who is thanking you for the rich talk and asking, do you and Chao try to compare some writings that the two systems might share in terms of similarities or differences, beginning from elements or words such as the sun, the moon, human, in the way in which they appear as writing?
Well, the short answer is we haven't been thinking along those lines. If you, well, Cao Dada is a very modest person. He will say he doesn't know anything about this. Of course, it's not true, but his main focus is not the writing system, but how you can interpret the writing to give a better understanding of the society, rather than how you can interpret the writing as a semiotic system in itself, let's say. But I think I would tend to say that once the system has developed as far as it has, either in Anyang or in later early dynastic Egypt, shall we say, about 2700, these have become very complex systems which have thousands of possibilities in them. In the Egyptian case, hundreds of signs, but thousands of combinations. In the Chinese case, thousands of signs. And then we really have to look at them internally, because they've got beyond the point at which they're developing fundamental new possibilities. New elements will always appear, but in smaller numbers, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions? I'm really almost dying to ask you one, if you don't mind, which is a little bit of a technical linguistic question, so I'm just going to ferry it out. When it comes to the formation of a script, some linguistic mechanisms can be seen, and I think you mentioned just earlier at the beginning of the discussion the possibility that some languages could have internal affordances that make writing more possible than others. And I'm thinking about Chinese and the omnipresence of rebus, and the possibility that rebus may be at the heart of that sort of springboard that makes writing possible. And I was wondering whether we could talk a little bit about the principle of homophony being present in Egyptian from Abydos, for instance, on the tags in the UJ cemetery tomb and cemetery at large. Because I remember reading, I think it was an article by Andras Stauder, who claimed that rebus was already there, and that is, to me, that is, you know, it opens so many avenues of you know, probing into the possibility of rebus really being at the core, and essentially one of the sort of affordances that make writing possible in general.
Well, I think you can see how writing can develop in different ways because languages have different structures. That makes good sense. So Chinese being a largely uninflected language, where the syllable is an essential element, then if you have a script which simply has lots and lots of signs for different elements, that makes good sense as a point of departure. But we have to remember that Old Chinese from more than 3,000 years ago was probably very unlike today's Chinese. And that what I've just said could be completely invalidated if people say, well, these things were polysyllabic or something like that. But what I think what's perhaps more important is the fact that you can combine things, morphemes is probably a nice neutral word, and word order in Chinese is very important. But because I don't know Chinese, I would hate to go further, except to say that you can see the difference when you look at Japanese, where Japanese is a polysyllabic language, which is highly inflected, and it struggles to be represented well in the East Asian script, and it adds these syllabic elements and things like that in order to do it. So you could say that Chinese is not great for the Chinese script as it developed was not great for Japanese, but they still managed to cope. Now, if you go to Egypt, I think one has to have a very high opinion of the people who developed the script, not maybe those who first devised it. I'm sure they were great too, but in a different way. Once you start having affixes and things of this sort written, then you have to have an idea of all sorts of linguistic features. So Egyptian is like Semitic languages, although it's not a direct member of the family, in that it has triconsonantal roots, variable position of vowels, and important affixes. The Egyptian script is developed in such a way that this is all possible. And vowels, then people don't bother with vowels. But with very many scripts, in fact, people don't write down the bits that are inconvenient. Linear B is it not a great example of that? Mm-hmm. That it works despite the fact that it isn't writing down everything in the language. So you can develop further. Now, I said that it seems to me that the Egyptians who developed the script around the beginning of the dynastic period must have thought about consonantal roots and the difference between consonants and vowels and things of that sort. But if you think about India, so there is this fantastic development of linguistics in ancient India in a period where, as far as we know, writing was not used. sophistication and expertise in language is something that we can assume is perfectly possible without writing, and it will be in the background to the later developments. In the case of Egyptian, as you say, there are affordances. Now, the problem is that when you go to the UJ system, Andreas Stauder, I think, is fairly skeptical as to whether this even constitutes a script. It's partly a matter of definition. If it does represent a script and it writes a language, we don't know what language actually. Whereas the excavator, who was not a linguistic specialist, assumed that it was Egyptian. Now, he could have been right, absolutely, but I don't think there's enough evidence to tell. And what I think we should definitely assume is that more than one language was spoken in the society. Probably, well, why stick at two? There could have been any number of languages, but we've got direct evidence in the Egyptian script itself for there being both Egyptian, this kind of isolate among the Afro-Asiatic languages, and a Semitic language, which coexisted in the formative period of the Egyptian script. That Semitic language disappeared from Egyptian writing. It's just present in one or two sign values. But it must have been there. And so if you are dealing with more than one language, then the important thing is mutual comprehension of what is being notated rather than whether a particular language is being notated. And there are all these traditions where people, you have a writing system where you write it out in Middle Persian or some such thing, and then you can read it in Arabic or something like that. And so people can do amazing things with writing systems too. I don't think we need to assume anything as radical as that for ancient Egypt. And the Egyptian script, of course, gives you lots of extra clues because you've got the semograms, meaning signs, determinatives, they go under all sorts of names, which help you to focus down on what a particular writing means. And word division in Egypt is also fairly easy. And so if you compare that with lots of other scripts, they do other things in order to make to be decipherable. But in the end, as people often point out, a lot of scripts can't be read if you don't know what is there. Mm-hmm. And that's another complication.
But would you go so far as to say that there's no evidence, for instance, of determinatives being present in the Abydos material?
I think we certainly can't demonstrate that there are determinatives there, no.
Okay.
Again, the excavator thought he could, so he was thinking of the standard understanding of Egyptian, where you have phonograms and determinatives, logograms, and he thought they were all present in the UJ material, but it's just not enough for us to be sure. Mm-hmm. Whereas one can be sure about that by the First Dynasty.
So it's a similar state of affairs as to the Uruk-4 period when it comes to proto-cuneiform, in a way.
I would say so, yes.
Okay,
And
proto-stage.
The Uruk-4 stage, of course, you've got thousands of examples, so yeah. It becomes much easier, at least, to try to work out what the system's doing.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Are there any more questions? It's been almost 2 hours, John. I told you that the discussion was going to be as rich as your seminar. Any more questions? Even in Italian. Oh, Tian again. Tian?
Oh, hi. Can I ask a second question, since we, deep down into the human mind behind the script? And I have a question both for Sylvia and Professor Baines here. Do you think that Egyptian and Chinese, they developed the language, the script? It takes not only the social background, but also some ability in human minds that can produce and to recognize a certain symbol. I mean, you talk about rebus system, and technically it is a system that allows human mind to tell the human that, look, this is not a sign that refers to the thing it's a different meanings. So do you think there's something else behind this? script development is something developed in human minds. So it could happen within few generations. What do you think?
Oh, very good.
Well, there are two questions in what you say, I think. One, one is, what is the role of the human mind in this? And the other is, how quickly can it happen? And in the case of the role of the human mind, I think actually anyone can do it. But of course, extremely few people have done it. It is a genuine invention. I remember thinking about this simply with children, that a child by the age of 3 or 4 is very capable of stimulating and saying one thing means another thing, and things. These are basic capacities of the human mind, which everyone has, and so the rebus is something which applies that in a particular context, but it's not something that's exceptional in general. Of course, people in different societies do this differently. But if you have a language where there are lots of homophones, then it may seem more obvious than if you don't. So I think it takes probably two things. First, somebody says, I think it would be good to be able to have something I can send to somebody else with a message on it, or whatever is the point of departure, or something which can be understood, which is put up in a public place. And then people develop something, and then when they develop it further, that often takes an enormous effort. So it's a multi-stage process. How fast that can happen is very, very variable, but I think that basically people often don't think about what the potential of a system is. If it works, you use it. And we've lost that sense because our culture places a fantastic emphasis on innovation and things of that sort. And indeed, as people who apply in the grant-giving world know, that you have to say that everything you do is an innovation. That sort of sense seems to have been much less prominent in ancient societies. And so I would say that most of these scripts served a perfectly good purpose the way they were. And then every now and then people would say, but we can do these other things with it. And then in some way it's expanded. But it isn't necessarily expanded in the direction of ease of use. Later Egyptian writing expands in the opposite direction, making it harder to read because you can enrich the meaning that is conveyed by the script by having a more complex form of it. And so there are many social possibilities which complicate all of that.
So John, would you say that writing, when it is invented, starts off as a discovery of the possibilities? Because I remember reading this wonderful book by Francis, Visible Speech, and he claims that really at the core of the invention of writing is the discovery that a thing can represent two things with the same sound but two completely different meanings, i.e. rebus and the possibility of homophony happening. And that is a very natural, spontaneous thing that happens. It happens to us when we write emojis with a homophonic core on WhatsApp or whatnot. And that possibility is just a mental flick. It's something that naturally, spontaneously happens in the human mind. But then that is the discovery, and that's as far as it goes. The next step is to make it become a different thing, and that's where the invention kicks in as a process. And that, as you say, is a process. It's something that requires, as far as Francis is concerned, a linguistic awareness, but perhaps a lot more in terms of agreement and harmony and alignment among different individuals that form a group and decide that writing has a purpose. But then, if that is true, and I strongly believe that that is true, what we have is really at the core a discovery that then becomes an invention.
I think that sounds very fair to me. I think that you've got people who are probably using homophones and playing with them and so on in their lives. And then somebody says, well, if we were to apply this in a graphic form, it would open up new possibilities. So it is, it's basically transferring a mental operation from a context where it's established into a new context. And then once that's been done, it's not the end of the process, because in order to expand the system to do other things, you've got to add other ways of doing it.
Yes. And that is where the necessity or the purpose or that sort of finalistic application can be actually seen in practice as a functional operation, as it were.
Yeah.
I find this very fascinating. You know, is writing discovered or is it invented? Are numbers discovered or are they invented? I would love to ask that to Stephen Chrysomalis. But yes, I think this is fascinating, because not only has our view of the invention of writing changed so much in the past generation, but we move beyond the monogenesis, the idea that Mesopotamia casts this long shadow on the invention, it's the only culture that invents writing, etc. But perhaps we need to be less rigid, as you mentioned earlier, as to the possibilities of writing and how writing is formally invented, and to what end, if necessity of an end is to be foreseen in our quest to understand how it was invented in the first place and in the many areas where it was invented. So we need to move beyond that sort of bureaucratic, rigid pattern and the idea that writing can be applied only to one end and to one purpose. I think we need to be much less rigid, much more flexible when it comes to the possibilities.
I think that's absolutely right. And one could add just one point to it, which is that when writing has been invented in all sorts of different places, mostly people have not assumed that the new script needs to look like the other one.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there are many exceptions to what I've just said, but I think the extreme case would be Indian scripts. But you've also got Arabian scripts. In both cases, you write down another language which hasn't been written before, and you have a new set of signs to do it.
Mm-hmm.
They are closely comparable with ones that you have in writing other languages in the same region, but they're not the same, because why should it be the same? It's our language, we'll do it our way.
Yeah.
And so we tend to, I think it's a very sort of imperialist Western view that there's one right way to do this, but that's not what writing looks like. It seems to be much more varied.
Let's move beyond imperialistic views. I think that's very necessary these days. Any more questions? No more questions. John, it was such a delight to have you. And I have more questions, but I don't want to tie you up. I know you're quarantining in England, so I don't want to keep you any further. It's been almost 2 hours, but it was wonderful. Such intense discussion as well. I did warn you that it was going to be intense and lovely, and you have very many people saying goodbye in the
yes,
chat.
I've noticed them doing that, yes.
Yeah. Judith Weingarten, Philippa Steele, Ruben, Manu. It was great to have you. I would love to welcome you in Bologna next time when we open the gates eventually. It would be my pleasure to invite you out to dinner with the whole SCRIBO group here in Bologna.
Well, it would be great to be able to do that. Let us hope we can, probably next year, not this year.
It was lovely to have you, and thank everybody for participating. This was the 5th SCRIBO, so it was a huge success. I'm so pleased. And I do remind you that we have Wilhelmine Ball next week, next Wednesday, 4:30 p.m. Italy time, with the origins of the alphabet, which seem to be older than we think. Thank you so much, everybody, and I'll see you next week. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you
And
very
my
much.
love to the whole family, to Jennifer and the kids.
Well, I will do that too, yes.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.